Okay, welcome Hua Chong students to your first macro lecture, okay, over Zoom. So we are basically going to teach you the main graph that you'll be using for macroeconomics, that is the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. So I trust that all of you are already in page 5.2.1. Oh, videos on. Okay, let me see. But it's on here. Okay, so can see me? Okay, thank you very much. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay. So to see a roadmap of what is going on so far in macroeconomics, the following topics are in part 1. Okay, ADAS is part 2. So these topics were covered in part 1. Now, depending on who your tutor is, they may or may not have already introduced you these topics during the tutorial. But if your tutor has gone through the topics, okay, basically they have introduced you to macro. They have spoken to you about the 4 macro goals in macroeconomics. Now, your tutor might have also gone through the circular flow of income. Okay, circular flow of income, where we taught you what are injections and what are withdrawals. And if they have the time, they might have even gone through standard of living, which they may have briefly introduced to you, material standard of living, as well as non-material standard of living. So these are the topics that are covered in part 1. Like, as I said, right, today is part 2. So we are at 5.2.3, which is the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply model. So let us try to activate your prior knowledge, what you have learned before in your term 1 and term 2. Okay. So let's ask. Now, let me ask all of you, what is the main framework used in microeconomics? Okay, let me pause for 5 seconds. What is the main graph that you all have drawn in microeconomics? If you recall correctly, okay, it is the demand and supply. So I hope you still recall that the demand curve is downward sloping, but the supply curve is upward sloping. What are some of the main lessons you have learned in that framework? Okay, so think back what you have learned in your first 6 months of econs. What are the main lessons you have learned in the demand and supply? Okay, which are basically factors that causes the shift in the demand and supply. Okay, so we have talked about why the demand shift to the right or to the left, why does the supply shift to the right to the left, but why do we shift those curves? Okay, it's because when we shift the curves, right, we are trying to figure out a few things. First, how can the price of the good change? Next, how can the quantity change? And finally, how does the expenditure or revenue, how might they change in the demand and supply, which is P times Q? Okay, so at this point of time, let's see whether I can draw this here. Oops. Okay, okay, let me try to draw this. Okay, let us draw together the demand and supply. Okay, so if you can, right, I would like you all to take out a piece of paper and see how does the demand and supply graph look quite similar to the aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph that we'll be teaching you in this lecture. That's what pen work I get. Let's draw on the left. Okay, as I'm drawing, right, can I encourage all of you all to draw with me on a piece of paper? Okay, so basically draw the demand and supply graph on the left, okay, which is basically price times quantity. You have your supply and demand. Note that there's a equilibrium quantity and an equilibrium price. So on the right of your page, right, let us try to draw the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph, which is actually figure 1 in page 5.2.3. X-axis is there, y-axis, x-axis. Now, for the y-axis of the ADAS, right, we call this the general price level. So if you look at figure 1, okay, the y-axis is called general price level or GPL. The x-axis, right, we put real national output. Now, let us first draw the aggregate supply graph. There's a horizontal part, there's a diagonal part, as well as a vertical part. I shall call this the AS curve. Now you can see one slight difference between this graph and the demand and supply, right? In the demand and supply, the supply curve usually just slope upwards, but in the AS curve, there are actually 3 parts, which we'll elaborate in this lecture. But the good thing is this, the aggregate demand is the same downward sloping line. So let's draw the aggregate demand. Okay, so this is called aggregate demand. So can you see that when the aggregate demand cuts the aggregate supply, right? There's also an equilibrium level of real national output or income. We call this the real GDP. And there's also a price level, P naught. Okay, we call this the existing general price level. So you can see, right, just as you have learned in your demand and supply, when the demand shifts to the right, okay, let's say from D0 to D1, do you see that the quantity increased from Q0 to Q1? So likewise, right, if you shift the aggregate demand to the right, okay, you will shift it like that, AD, let me call it AD0 and AD1. Can you see that there's also an increase in the real national output? So in a sense, right, if your econs tutor have taught you one of the macro goals, which is economic growth, okay, this is one way in which economic growth can occur. But let's look at the y-axis. Let's look at the graph on the left. Can you see that the price level for this particular good has gone up from P0 to P1? But if you look at the graph on the right, can you see? Just like the demand and supply graph, right? The price have also gone up. But this time, we call this the general price level going up. Now, in macroecons, right, this is what we call inflation. Okay, so if there are 4 macro goals, one of the goals that your tutor may have said to you in class is that most governments want the inflation to be low. Okay, so if this happens from P0 to P1, that means there is some inflation that's impacting this economy. So from this simple comparison of the graph on the left as well as the graph on the right, I hope you can see that the main things that you have to learn in this lecture is basically why the curve shift. Why does the aggregate demand shift to the right or shift to the left? And why does the aggregate supply also can shift to the left and shift to the right? So this lecture is basically talking about all the factors that will either shift the aggregate demand or the aggregate supply. So I hope that's clear. Okay, let me move on. Okay, so as I said, think of what you have learned in the first 6 months of your econs, right? The demand and supply framework is used to determine why does prices and quantities change for various goods. If that's the case, right, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply is used to determine why does the general price level and the national income change for various countries. Okay, so you can immediately see the contrast here. For micro, right, it's for just a particular good, just a particular market. But in macro, we want to determine how does the real GDP as well as the general price level change for the country as a whole. But why is that important in macroeconomics? So let's recall again the 4 macro goals in page 5.1.4. Now, if your tutor has not gone through yet, you may put your finger at 5.2.3, put your thumb or your finger, and you turn back to 5.1.4. If you do that, right, you realize that in page 5.1.4, which is in part 1 of your macroeconomics, there are actually 4 macro goals. So the first goal, right, is what we call sustain. sustainable, and inclusive growth. Okay, basically we want economic growth to be sustained, we want it to be sustainable, and we want it to be inclusive. Next, we also want the goal of full employment. Anyone who wants to work, right, should be able to find a job. The third goal is, as I've said, you want inflation to be low. Some other schools will call it price stability. Okay, it's basically the same thing. And next, this is the only external goal in macroeconomics. We want the balance of payments to be healthy or favorable. So these are basically the 4 macro goals in 5.1.4. Okay, once you're ready, you can turn back to 5.2.3. Now, let's look at the introduction of 5.2.3. If your tutor managed to go through the circular flow of income in your class, he or she, right, would have emphasized this point. Okay, this point is this: higher injections, such as the increase in investment, government expenditure, as well as export revenue, leads to higher national income and hence employment. Okay, let me repeat that again. In the circular flow of income, right, we have taught you what are injections and what are withdrawals or leakages. Now, your tutor would have emphasized this point. In the circular flow of income, if the injections go up, if there are higher injections, it will lead to a higher national income and hence employment. Okay, this is the underlying sentence if you look at it in your introduction in 5.2 and 5.3. Can I recommend that all of you highlight that sentence now? However, what the circular flow of income does not tell you is this: how much of an injection do we need for full employment? It only tells you, right, that if you inject more I, inject more G, inject more X, okay, you will get closer to the goal of full employment. But we want to know how much of an injection is actually needed to reach full employment, to reach the maximum growth. And of course, the circular flow of income cannot tell you what causes inflation. Have you realized that if your tutor has gone through, right, there is no general price level in the circular flow of income? Okay, so we want to also know what could cause inflation in a country. What could cause the general price level to increase? So we need a diagram with the general price level, and it turns out that there is such a diagram called the aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So here are some examples of macro questions that we will typically ask you in the essays as well as case studies. Okay, let's pause. Let's if you can, right, put your finger in 5.2.3 and you turn back to 5.1.4. If you look at the bottom of 5.1.4, okay, one of the things that we will ask you is this: what could cause macroeconomic problems to happen in a country? So the examples of any of these macro problems, okay, are that when the 4 goals are not reached. For example, what caused unemployment? What caused inflation? What caused recession? Anytime you have unemployment, anytime you have too high a level of unemployment, that means the goal of full employment is not reached. Likewise, anytime you have high inflation, that means the goal of low inflation is not reached. And finally, anytime you see a recession, that means the goal of economic growth, the goal of sustained economic growth is also not reached. Okay, so we want to know what could cause these problems. So you may have learned that last year, right, Singapore went into a recession. Okay, a recession is when we have a fall in GDP or negative economic growth. In fact, last year our economic growth was negative for the entire year. So we want to know what could have caused that to happen to Singapore in the year 2020. And finally, once we know the cause, right, we also need to know, okay, since there's a recession, since there was a recession in Singapore in 2020, what can the government do? What policies can the government use to cure these problems? That means, how can they restore economic growth? How can they get back to full employment? Or how can they keep inflation low? Now, I like to call this, right? Mr. Tan would like to call this the 2Cs of macroeconomic question. If you see what I've written in the slides, right? I bold the word cost and I bold the word cure. Okay, so these are the what I call the 2Cs of macroeconomic questions. You will see plenty of such questions in year 1 as well as in year 2. Okay, if you think about it, right, think of all the market failure questions you have done as you prepare for your block test 1. Okay, if you look back at your block test 1 essays, do you realize that your part A essays, right, your essay question part A is what causes the market failure? So you have imperfect information, you have public goods, you have externality. So that is part A of your question. After you address part A of the question, part B asks you, what are the best policies? What are the current policies the Singapore government is doing in order to get back into allocative efficiency? So if you think about it this way, right, your micro questions, right, a lot of them are also about the two C's, the causes and the cures. So you should be happy to know that even in macroeconomics, many of your questions will be like that. So we want to use the same graph, right? The ADAS graph to answer both questions. What could have caused macroeconomic problems and what policies can the government use to cure it? So that's why you got to pay attention for this lesson. Okay, the ADAS already tells you certain starting points, right? As I've shown you as I draw the ADAS graph, if you look back at your figure 1, okay, figure 1, can you see that as the AD shift to the left, okay, if the AD were to decrease, the real national output will fall? Okay, so already that tells you that, hey, if I want to explain what could cause a recession, I must find a way to explain why the aggregate demand shift to the left. And if it does shift to the left, I would have explained why the real GDP would fall. Conversely, if I want to explain why is there inflation, okay, you can see, right? I can just shift the aggregate demand to the right. Now, if I can find a way to explain that, we will be able to tell the marker why is there inflation in any economy. So already you can see that the ADAS graph tells you certain starting points to explain. So for the rest of this lesson, we're going to teach you what are the factors that will shift the aggregate demand as well as the aggregate supply. Okay, so you draw figure 1 together and show. Let us draw quickly. Okay, I'm drawing this a lot of times because you must develop what I will call to my classes, muscle memory. Okay, so for your tutors, right, we can draw this pretty fast. It's because we have drawn this 1,000,000 times over the years. Okay, but you must keep drawing. Okay, so after this lesson, right, try to draw at home many times. If you want to save time, you want to draw this now. So you can see, right, as I said, when AD shifts to the left, from AD0 to AD1, can all of you see that the real national output or the real national income has fallen? Okay, so that is bad. So I'll often put a frowny face here. Okay, when there's a fall in the real national output, that is bad. Okay, but the good thing in the semi-good thing, as you can see in the graph, is that there's a slight fall in the general price level. So under normal circumstances, right, this might be good. Okay, this might be good. Let me put a smiley face. On the other hand, okay, if you want to explain inflation, you will shift the AD to the right. AD0, let me call this AD2. Can you see that when you shift to AD2, okay, the bad thing, if you can see on the y-axis, is that the general price level has gone up. So in econs, right, in macroecons, we call this inflation. So that is usually seen as bad. So I put a frowny face here. But can you see that this somewhat good thing is that the national income actually increases. Okay, increases. So if there's real GDP growth in this case, we might say it is good. Okay, so you can really see that there's a sort of a clash of the goals, right? Now the clash of the macro goals will be an important theme that we'll only cover next year. But from this graph, you can really see that when the aggregate demand, right, when it shifts to the right or when it shifts to the left, under normal circumstances, if you are at the diagonal part of the AS curve, there's one good thing, but there's one bad thing. So isn't this graph fun? So let me say that again, this aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph is the main workhorse graph that you'll be using. So it behooves you to make sure you can master how to draw the graph and how to shift the various curves. Okay, let's move on. By the end of this lecture, right? Wow, the introduction is pretty long. Huh? Okay, so as I said, let me try to big picture this entire lesson. Okay, you have to learn what are the factors that will shift the aggregate demand, which is found in page 5.2.3 all the way to 5.2.10. Next, there's a special concept called the multiplier. Okay, what the multiplier is how a change in any of the injections. So if you recall, right, there are three injections in the circular flow: investment, government expenditure, and export revenue. So the special concept known as the multiplier is to teach you how a change in any of these injections can actually lead to a more than proportionate change in national income. This one is important, but because it is quite technical, there are lots of technical details, we will not be covering the multiplier concept in this lecture, but your tutors will be covering this after the promos. Okay, the multiplier concept is found in page 5.2.11 to 5.2.14. We will not be covering the multiplier in this lecture. After that, we will cover what are factors that shift the short-run aggregate supply. Okay, so you will learn that the short-run aggregate supply is actually the diagonal part of the AS curve. So it's found in 5.2.15 to 5.2.17. And finally, we will talk about factors that shift the vertical aggregate supply, which is the long-run aggregate supply found in page 5.2.17 to 5.2.18. Once we find out how all these three parts shift, right, we will be ending off with to show you how is the economy in equilibrium. Okay, what is the macroeconomic equilibrium? As well as how do you apply the ADAS to answer some questions. So can I encourage all of you, right, as we are going through this lesson, always have some foolscap paper with you. I would like all of you, right, to get ready a piece of foolscap paper now. Okay, what I want you all to do is this: as I'm going through the lesson, I want you to put the foolscap paper in landscape mode and draw three columns. Okay, I often do this in all my classes. So can I get all of you to do that? Take out a piece of paper. Okay, put the foolscap paper in landscape mode and let us draw three columns together. So I shall do it right here in front of you. I always love doing this. Okay, so these are how you can, as I teach, right, you can learn much better. Your brain can retain the information much better. So you can say AD. So on the first column, you put aggregate demand. On the second column, you put SRAS. And finally, on the third column, you put LRAS. So this is the bulk of the lesson that we are going through today. So as I explained to you the various factors that shift the AD, shift the SRAS, and shift the LRAS, you're free to write the stuff that I've said, write the stuff that's in your brain into the foolscap paper. Is that clear? Okay, so let us now turn to aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay, aggregate demand curve comprised of consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net export revenue. So what do we mean by aggregate demand? Aggregate demand is the total spending on domestically produced goods and services made in an economy at each general price level for a given period of time. Now, you'll be very familiar with this once you probably by the middle of your J2. Okay, that AD, right, is basically C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So if your tutors have gone through the circular flow with you, right, you should know that C is consumption, I is investment, G is government expenditure, X is export revenue, and M is import expenditure. Okay, so these are the points. So one quick answer to the question, what shift the demand curve? Remember this, changes in any of the components, C, I, G, or net exports, X minus M, will shift the aggregate demand. The shape of the AD curve, right? Let's turn to 5.2.4. The shape of the AD curve is basically downward sloping, just like your demand curve. So if you ask me, right, if you look at thinking question 1, where they ask you to compare the similarities and difference, that is actually the only similarity. Both the microeconomic demand curve as well as the macroeconomic aggregate demand curve, they are both downward sloping. The rest are all different. Okay, you can go through with your tutors in class and your tutors will show you the answer. But as of now, I can tell you that is the only similarity. Why do we draw the aggregate demand curve downward sloping? What it basically means is that a decrease in the general price level will indeed lead to a higher CI or X. So when you go down the aggregate demand curve, right, the aggregate demand is higher. But take note, this is a movement along the aggregate demand curve. Now, if you recall your first 6 months of econs, right, we always emphasize to you the difference between a change in the quantity demanded as well as a change in demand. So in a sense, right, even for the aggregate demand curve, okay, when there's a change in the general price level alone, the AD doesn't shift, even though it is true that the bottom part of the aggregate demand curve, the CI or X, is also higher than the top part. But you don't shift the aggregate demand curve. You can read the appendix to figure out why, but they will not ask you to explain why in your H2 syllabus. Okay, just know that anytime a change in the general price level, right, you do not shift the aggregate demand curve, but only when changes in C, I, G, X minus M, that change independent of general price level, then you shift the aggregate demand curve. So we are supposed to understand how the individual components C, I, G, X minus M changes. Okay, so that's basically 5.2.4. So as I said, right, any increase in these components that are independent of the general price level, they will shift the aggregate demand curve. Okay, so if you recall your struggles with demand and supply, okay, if you could turn back the clock, you might have wished this, right? That you spend more time remembering the factors that shift demand curve as well as the factors that shift supply curve. So can I encourage all of you, don't waste this time in the lecture. Okay, you have this time, pay attention. What are the factors that will shift the aggregate demand curve? Trust me, okay, even in the second year, your year 2 friends, right, they are wishing they could turn back the clock right now and they would have paid more attention to this lecture on what could cause C, I, G, X minus M to change. Okay, I encourage you all to pay attention. Okay, as I've said, any increase in these components independent of general price level will shift the aggregate demand curve. So let's go through the first one, consumption expenditure. What do we mean by consumption? Okay, it is a spending by households on goods and services to satisfy current wants. What do we mean by income? Your first factor, right, is this term called disposable income. This is the income after personal income tax. Okay, personal income tax. So what we will teach you probably in the second year is that if the government, right, if we lower the personal income tax, you'll find that households that box in the circular flow of income will have a higher disposable income. So the higher the disposable income, the greater is the consumption. So we'll teach you this under the term called fiscal policy. Okay, you'll be very familiar with this term by the time you are your second year. So this is how the government might use the disposable income in order to increase consumption and hence shift the aggregate demand to the right. So just remember, disposable income is the income after personal income tax. So can I encourage you now? Okay, I realize that the bottom part of your 5.2.4, right? Can I encourage you to write the term fiscal policy in the space? Just write it on the left. I realize this set of notes, right? They have the term monetary policy, but they don't have the term fiscal policy. So can I encourage you to write the term now? Okay, the spelling is there. So this is one of the main policies that the government used, right, in order to manipulate the aggregate demand curve. Fiscal policy. Next, economic outlook. So we are at 5.2.5. This is concerning the consumer's optimism or pessimism, right, regarding the future outlook of the economy. Okay, basically, when you are more optimistic about the future, you tend to want to consume more. However, if you are pessimistic of the future, you will consume less. So if you ask me, right, my tip is this is very similar to the popular reason, the change in taste and preference in your demand and supply. If you recall your first 6 months of econs, right, taste and preference are anything that makes you consume more or consume less, even when your income doesn't change. Okay, so for example, last year, right, if you see the COVID-19 pandemic happening in Singapore, even if you keep your job, even if you manage to keep your job, right, your current income remains the same, but you will feel pessimistic about your future. You will fear that you will lose your job. If that's the case, then you will tend to consume less, even if your income doesn't change. So this will cause a shift to the left of the aggregate demand curve. Next will be wealth. Now, wealth is a very interesting term. So you might ask the question, right? What is the difference between income, which is disposable income, and wealth? I like to call this the difference between the flow and the stock. If you read your notes under the income, the first paragraph of wealth, right? Do you realize that there's a time dimension? That means income refers to the earnings of households per time period. This I'm quoting direct from your notes. So income basically only makes sense if I include the time dimension. Let me tell you what I mean. Let me try to explain to you what I mean. Let's look at this question. Now, if you tell me you earn an income of $1,000, can I conclude that you are rich? Can I conclude that you are earning a high income? Okay, let me pause for a while to ask all of you. If the only information I have is that someone earns an income of $1,000, notice I didn't put the time period. Okay, can you think to yourself? Okay, the WhatsApp icon, right? Can I conclude that the person earning 1,000 is rich? Okay. Okay. Can you see that just knowing that someone earns $1,000, I cannot really say whether you're rich, okay? Because it lacks the time dimension. What if I tell you that this person actually earns 1,000 per year? Most of you all conclude that you'll be quite low, right? If I tell you I only earn 1,000 per year. Now, what if I change it to 1,000 per month? Now, for most of you all, that may also be seen to be quite low. But what if I say $1,000 per hour or $1,000 per minute? Then you can see, you will conclude that this guy is a rich man. This guy earns a high income because he earned 1,000 per minute. This is what I'm trying to say when I say income is a flow concept. It only makes sense. You can only conclude whether the income is high or low, right? By including the time dimension. Otherwise, it will mislead you. However, wealth, right? You can know whether someone is wealthy or not just by knowing how much his house is worth, how much is the value of his share portfolio. Okay, that's what we call wealth as a stock concept. If I know that you are living in a house that is worth 2 million, 3 million, 4 million, if I know that your total share portfolio is worth 2 million, 3 million, I do not need to know the time dimension to know that this person is wealthy, right? So that's the difference between income and wealth. Wealth, you don't need, there's no time dimension in the wealth concept. That's why we call it a stock concept, okay, at a given point of time. So what I'm trying to say is this: if there's a boom in the stock market, okay, or if the housing market does very well, the price of the house goes up, people feel wealthy, they will immediately increase their consumption. Note that this is actually independent of income. So that's why your aggregate demand curve would shift to the right. Conversely, right, if the stock market crash, if it crash all the way down, people will feel poor. They'll feel poor even if the income they earn from their job remains the same. So when they feel poor, they will tend to consume less. Okay, so as the wealth changes, your AD curve will shift because the consumption will shift. So you think about the 2009 subprime crisis, the financial crisis, the stock market crash, the housing market also crashed. This explains why the aggregate demand of many countries fall. Okay, this is the wealth concept. Of course, more recently, right, just this year, you may have read about this. If you have done the SLS, the home-based learning that I talk about in the SLS, right? How the Chinese have been clamping down. Okay, the Chinese PM have been clamping down on some of the rich firms in China. We have Alibaba. Okay, I'm sure you know Jack Ma and Alibaba. We also know Tencent. Tencent is an entertainment company, and I've also learned there's one company in China called Didi. Okay, Didi is like their Grab car, their Grab taxis. So the Chinese government is clamping down on them. Okay, this is a very bad risk. So as a result, the stock market in China crashed. You can see in the news, right? 760 billion wiped out. So even if you keep your job, even your income remains the same, you will feel poor. And when you feel poor, you will tend to consume less, and hence the aggregate demand will shift to the left. Next, availability and cost of credit. Most of the things that we buy, right, your lunch, your iPhone, you typically use cash, right? But there are other goods where most of us will borrow from the bank in order to buy them. For example, these are what we call in econs call big ticket items like cars and houses. So what happens is this: if the interest rates are low, can you see? From the household's point of view, it is cheaper for them to borrow from the bank, and hence you find that the consumption of such big ticket items will tend to rise. Okay, so this again is independent of the general price level, independent of national income. So this means if I lower the interest rate, consumption of big tickets items will rise, consumption will rise, aggregate demand will shift to the right. So in your, like I said, this is important for the policy called monetary policy. So as I said to you, the term monetary policy is actually spelled out in your notes. Can I encourage all of you to underline or highlight the term monetary policy now? So this will be important when we talk about the cures, lowering interest rate. Of course, if I raise the interest rate, then it becomes more expensive for households to borrow to buy big ticket items. Hence, consumption will fall, AD will shift to the left. So thinking question 2, okay, since I'm not going through the multiply, we are studying more time, let's look at thinking question 2. Let me pause for a while and let you read. So the question is, right, when there's a recession, is savings good or bad? Okay, your tutor will probably go through this in class, but let me go through it quickly here. When you are not in a recession, when times are good, savings is generally good. Okay, because the more an economy save, the more funds are there for investment. Think of what you have done in your PPC in your first few months of econs, right? You have learned about the distinction between capital goods and consumer goods. Your tutor would have gone through that. If many households in the economy choose not to consume, that means they save, there are more funds for investment. Hence, you can expect a faster growth in the long run. So when times are good, okay, more savings means more growth. Okay, that's what I'm trying to say. However, if times are bad, if you are in a recession, more savings, right, means less immediate consumption. Now, in the short run, right, what I'm trying to say is that in the long run, okay, the more you save, the more you grow. But in the short run, the more you save, right, the less is the immediate consumption. So if C boosts the economy, okay, but when times are bad, if households still want to save, right? If you save more means your income is lower. So what you're trying to say is it's better to spend in the short run. Let's say you are having a recession, it's better to actually spend now. After the economy recover, then you save. Okay, so this is the basic approach for thinking question 2. Okay, I like to give this an analogy. Think of a track and field runner. Okay, so when times are good, when she is very fit, more training is good, right? The more she trains, the more her time will improve. But what if she's injured? So think of an economic recession as a time where this track and field athlete is injured. Now, can you see that if you are injured and you still insist on training, in the short run, it will make your condition even worse? Okay, so even though I say that training is good, right? It doesn't mean that it's always good in all circumstances. Okay, but when times are bad, when she's injured, she should not train. She should rest first. Okay, once she rests, she'll recover. After she recovers, she can then go back to training again and the time will improve. So this is the analogy I like to use for thinking question 2. So if you're ready, let's turn to 5.2.6. I hope things are quite fun for you. Okay, what do we mean by investment expenditure? Investment is a spending by businesses or firms on the acquisition of physical capital goods. So as I've said, and your tutors may have said, investment is an injection. So if you recall what I made your underline, right? Investment, any injection will cause the flow of national income to expand and hence the national income to increase. Investment is important as a form of capital formation. As I've taught you under the PPC, right? The more the firms invest, the more capital good is there, the faster the rate of growth for capital goods, and hence the productive capacity will rise and hence promote economic growth. Okay, you can read through the various types of investment on your own. So let's ask the question. Okay, I've really gone through many reasons why households would increase consumption. So let's think, why do firms invest? So this is what called the benefits versus cost analogy. Firms basically invest, right, only if they expect whatever investment project they undertake to be profitable. Like all economic agents, okay, your tutor may have gone through certain decision-making questions in your class for microecons. You'll be glad to know that decision-making is also a commonly asked question, even in macroeconomics. So let's use the decision-making framework to answer the question, why do firms invest? So firms basically compare benefits and costs. Now, what is the benefit? The benefit is this term called the marginal efficiency of investment. Okay, it measures the expected rate of return from an additional unit of investment. So for example, if MEI is 10%, every $10 of investment undertaken by the firm generates $1 expected return. But note, this is not the same as the interest rate. The interest rate represents the cost of borrowing. Here, right, we assume that firms have no money on their own. So in order for firms to undertake any kind of investment, they have to borrow from the bank. So when they borrow from the bank will charge them the current rate of interest. So don't mix up MEI with interest rate. Okay, MEI is the benefit to the firm for investing. Interest rate is the cost to the firm. Okay, if you think back at your demand curve, right, it's the same, right? The price, let's say we are talking about Coca-Cola, okay, the drink Coke. The price of the Coke, right, is your cost of buying Coke. But the utility from drinking Coke is your benefit, right? So the price is not the utility, but we choose the amount of Coke to drink, right? Based on the marginal utility of the final can, we equate it to the price. So that's how you should see MEI and interest rate. So the firm's decision-making process is so long as MEI is greater than the rate of interest. So as I said, right, MEI is the benefit of investing, interest is the cost. Firms should keep on investing since it can earn more profits. So this is very similar to your profit max, right? So if your tutors went through this many times with you, right? This is similar to MR more than MC. Now, if MR more than MC, the firm should keep producing and selling because the increase in TR is more than the increase in TC, hence the profit increase. However, if MEI is less than interest rate, is the same as MC more than MR, firms should cut back on investing. Okay, shouldn't invest so much. So if you're keen, right, you can put your thumb or finger in page 5.2.7 and turn to the appendix in 5.2.33. Okay, you don't have to draw this graph in your essays. Okay, but I think this graph is very good to give you a pictorial understanding of what I just said, as well as to understand how it is very similar to the demand curve in your microecons. So this is the MEI curve. Okay, this is the rate of interest. This 10%, right? You can think of this 10% as the cost of borrowing that the bank charges the firms. So can you see that at 10% interest rate, right? Firms will undertake the investment all the way to a certain level. Okay, at anywhere on the left of the investment level, can you see that the MEI is more than the interest rate? That means firms should invest. But after that critical level, the MEI is now less than the interest rate, so firms should reduce investment. This is where we say that investment projects are not profitable. So basically, firms will invest up to the point where the final investment project, the MEI is just equals to the rate of interest. Okay, so I star represents the optimal level of interest. So this is what 5.2.33 is telling you. That's why it's very similar to the microecons demand curve. When should firms start investing? Okay, as I said, the optimal level of investment is MEI equals R. So the key is this. What if you want firms to undertake more investment? So you should lower the interest rate. So this is the cost of borrowing to the firm. This will be under monetary policy, which will be covered in future lessons. Okay, I've said this to all my 4 classes, so I might as well give this now. I like to use this analogy, right, for students to try to understand what is this MEI and R thing. So can you imagine, right, this scenario? I invite you all to a room. Okay, let's say the current classroom you're in now, there are dollar bills on the floor, all over the floor. Okay, there are one $1 bill, $2 bill all the way to $10 bills. There are so many $10 bills, so many $9 bills, $8 bills, all the way to $1 bill. I tell you this, okay? You can pick any bill on the floor and you can keep the bill. Okay, you can keep the bill. But the catch is this: you got to pay me $5 for every bill you pick up. Okay, I'll pause for a while for the rest of the classes to understand this scenario. Your classroom now have so many dollar bills, various denominations, 1 to 10. You can pick any bill on the floor, but I charge you $5 for every bill you pick up. Okay, now if you think about it from DN's point of view, right? How many bills will you pick up given that I charge you $5 for every bill? So think of the value of the bill you pick up, right, as your MEI, and the cost I charge you is $5 as the rate of interest. Is it clear that you will definitely not just pick up the $10 bills and leave the rest on the floor, right? If you're foolish enough to just pick up the $10 bill, you are giving up all the profitable bills to pick up. Because even though the gap between 10 to 5 is the largest, okay, you are not maximizing your profit if you leave the $9 bill, the $8 bill, the $7 bill, as well as the $6 bill on the floor. So is it clear that your MEI is more than, if you stop there, right, if you only pick up the $10 bill, you are not maximizing your net gain. Okay, so you'll pick up the $10 bills, you'll pick up the $9 bills, you'll pick up the $8 bills, you'll pick up the $7 bill, $6 bills, you'll pick up all the way until the final bill. The return of that bill to you just equals to the cost I am charging you for every bill you pick up. Okay, so you can imagine if say the bill is worth like 5.01, it will be worthwhile for you to pick that bill up, right? Because 5.01 is still more than 5, right? So you'll pick up until the very last bill, right? The return just equals to the cost. Okay, that is the same decision making that firms make when it comes to investment. Okay, I hope you are clear. I love this analogy. I gave this analogy for a lot of this analogy, right? Okay, let me say this. This is what we call the marginalist principle. Your tutor may have said this many times. Have you realized that the marginalist principle is seen in microecons as well as macroecons? Okay, anytime we make a decision, consumers, firms, and government, we always weigh the incremental benefit of whatever we do. We equate it to the incremental cost. The optimum choice is when the incremental benefit of the final action that we make equals to the incremental cost. This marginalist principle is everywhere in econ, so you should be happy to know this. Okay, so this is the firm's decision making for investment. So there are other factors that will change investment levels. Okay, so these are, okay, we'll talk about interest rate already. So change in R. There are business expectations, corporate tax, innovation and technology, cost of new capital goods. This will shift the MEI. So if you recall the MEI graph to understand this, right, have you realized that interest rate is on the y-axis? So just like your demand curve, right, if I lower the interest rate, firms will undertake more investment, but it's a movement along the MEI curve. However, factors 2 to 5, right? These are factors that will actually shift the MEI curve to the right. Now, for your H2 syllabus, you do not have to draw the MEI curve, but this is how you can visualize how it works. So let's quickly go through some of these factors that shift the MEI curve. Business expectation. So this is very, if you want to kill two birds with one stone, right? Business expectation is similar to the economic outlook for C. Okay, for C. So the more optimistic firms are, the more they will invest. The opposite is also true. The more pessimistic firms are, the less they will invest. So such expectation by firms, right, they can be rather volatile. Firms, right, they can suddenly be optimistic, suddenly be pessimistic. No one knows why. So in the real world, right, in many countries, the I component is very volatile. So John Maynard Keynes, right, the economist that taught most of these macro econs you are learning now, deem this as animal spirits. Okay, so this animal spirits, I realize it appear in your notes. This is what it means. Corporate tax. Now, MEI is actually the gross rate of return. Okay, however, if there's corporate tax, right, firms don't just look at the gross rate of return. The key MEI is now based on the after tax, or what I call the net rate of return. So there's difference in gross and net. Net is after tax. So if the government adjusts the corporate tax rate, right, the key is that it will also affect MEI. So you'll basically shift the MEI. So if I lower the corporate tax rate, MEI will shift to the right. Firms will undertake more investment. But if I raise the corporate tax rate, MEI will shift to the left. Firms will undertake less investment. So just like what I've asked you all to do for the disposable income, right? Can I encourage all of you now? Okay, under the corporate tax in 5.2.7, write the term fiscal policy, which is the last paragraph of page 5.2.7. Okay, write the term fiscal policy on the right-hand side of the corporate tax, the paragraph. So you can see, right? If the government wants to adjust C, wants to adjust I, they can use various tax. I can change the personal income tax, which will affect households' disposable income. I can also change the corporate income tax, which will change the firm's net rate of return. Hence, firms will also change their investment. So you can see the cures, right? There are already many things you can say. Okay, corporate tax. So all these will be taught to you more next year. And of course, 5.2.8, right? You can highlight the term monetary policy, which I'll come to that soon. Okay, cost of capital goods basically can be the absolute cost of capital. So if the price of machineries were to go down, MEI would increase, firms will invest more. Can also be relative cost. So if I don't want to adjust the absolute cost of capital, I can make labor more expensive. So if I raise the wage rate, right, firms will find that no, relatively speaking, it is cheaper for me to use capital. So if it's cheaper for me to use capital, I would increase my investment. Hence, I'll use less labor and more capital. So this is what we call switch from labor intensive to capital intensive. So this is the current policy that's frequently used in Singapore now. Okay, we have been restricting the foreign worker inflow. We also raised the foreign worker levy. So what we are doing here is that we are basically changing the relative cost of using capital. That's how we encourage firms to switch. Don't use so much labor, but use more capital. So next year, right, we will teach you this under supply side policies. And finally, interest rate. So as I said, right, if you want firms to increase investment, you can lower interest rate. So just like lowering interest rate can lower the cost of borrowing and makes households borrow more to buy big ticket items, it can also increase investment. Recall my dollar bills on the floor analogy. So if I charge you $5 to pick up any bill, right, it is not profitable for you to pick up the $4 bill, right? Because your MEI is less than the interest rate. But what if I'm the government? I want to incentivize you, all of you, to pick up the $4 bill. I can't charge you $5, right? What can I do? I can lower my cost of picking up the bill to $3. Let's say I lower from 5 to 3, right? Can you all see? Nah, the $4 bill now becomes profitable for you to pick up. Okay, so the phrase, okay, so can I ask you again, highlight the term monetary policy? So as I said to you just now, look at 5.2.8. There's a term monetary policy. We even bold it for you. Can you highlight the term? So what we will teach you next year is that just like the dollar bill analogy, if I lower the interest rate, if the central bank lower the interest rate, suddenly the firm will find that more investment projects will become profitable. Just like if I lower the cost of picking up the bill to $3, suddenly the $4 bill becomes very profitable. So you will pick it up, right? So firms will increase investment. Okay, let me pause for a while to write this phrase down for future use. Okay, we won't test you on monetary policy in year one, but in your second year, right, you'll be explaining how the government can use monetary policy to shift the AD curve. So this phrase is the proper phrase to use. Let me give you some time to write this phrase down for future use. So as I always tell my classes, right, you have to write this many, many times because you have to develop what you call muscle memory. You got to write all these very fast. You cannot use the wrong term. Please do not say that lower interest rate raise MEI. That's not correct. Huh? Okay, the MEI remains the same. The MEI is based on the return that the investment gives to the firm. It is independent of the cost of borrowing. But by lowering the cost of borrowing, more investment projects are profitable. That's why the firms undertake more investment. That's the right way to say it and the wrong way to say it. So write this phrase down as you cover year two, where you turn back the clock and look back to your year one life. You would have wished that you remember what I'm saying to you now. Okay, fine. Okay, we have done most of the work already, so I'll talk a bit about G and M before going for a break. Government expenditure. So this one is another way in which the government can use fiscal policy, FISCAL, to manipulate the aggregate demand curve, which is to increase or decrease G. So there's recurrent expenditure. This is basically spent every month, every year. But there's also one-off expenditure called capital or infrastructure, okay, the building of MRT lines. Now, I will not go through all the factors in 5.2.9, but I'll look at the term counter-cyclical. If you look at part 3 under macroeconomic factors, do you see the word counter-cyclical? Okay, let me spend 1 or 2 minutes to go through this because this one can come out in your case studies, and you often see the term counter-cyclical in many of the newspapers, so it's good to understand what it means. Okay, let us draw an ADAS curve and analyze together now. Okay, I'm going to draw it here. Okay, as I'm drawing, can you draw with me? Okay, so let me switch this windows to the top. Okay, can you see at this AD naught and AS, right? There's this. What do we mean by counter-cyclical? So let's say, for example, the economy is doing very well. Okay, that means the X is booming, the investment is booming, the consumption is booming. AD shifts to the right, and it shifts a lot to the right. So this is the upside of the business cycle. That means business is booming. Okay, can you see that? Ceteris paribus, when X or I or G booms, AD shift to the right. This will lead to inflation. So what typically the government does that if it doesn't want inflation, they will try to slow down the increase in aggregate demand. They don't want the aggregate demand to increase too fast. So in this case, the government will purposely cut G. So if there's a rise in I, rise in X, okay, rise in C, government, to stop the aggregate demand curve from shifting too much to the right, they will deliberately cut G. So they will go against the rise in the AD. And conversely, suppose times are bad, AD shifts to the left. Let's say I suddenly falls, X suddenly falls, C suddenly falls, right? Can you see that it tends to lead to a sharp fall in the real national income? So what the government will do is that they don't want the AD curve to fall so much, to fall so sharply. So they purposely try to shift the AD to the right by increasing G. So they go against the business cycle. So if the economy is doing very well, okay, the government will deliberately cut G. That's called counter-cyclical. Likewise, when the AD falls, okay, the government will deliberately increase G. That is called counter-cyclical. You go against the AD shift. Okay, this is what called counter-cyclical. So if you have any questions, you can further ask your tutors in class. Okay, finally, export revenue before I give you a break. Okay, net export revenue X minus M. So you should explain X minus M as a whole. Okay, try not to explain M alone. Okay, you can explain X alone, but don't explain M alone. Your tutors will tell you why in the class. So it's either you talk about X alone or X minus M. Don't talk about M alone. Okay, okay. Let's see how export revenue is affected. Basically, export revenue is affected by the level of income in the foreign country, not your income, but their income. Okay, so as they get richer, if you're selling goods that are normal, that means the demand for your exports will tend to increase. Also, it depends on your export competitiveness. How good are your exports? There will be quality. How cheap are the exports? There will be the price level. So it is affected by income and prices as well as the quality. Now, for import expenditure, it depends on the level of income in the domestic country. So if export depend on the income of the foreign country, import is depend on your income. So if your income goes up, you tend to buy more imports. If income goes down, you tend to buy less imports, assuming your imports are normal goods. So you will use YED when you talk about export revenue and import expenditure. So let's do this simple question. Question 4. Okay. Let's all look at this question and ask, which of these changes will not shift the AD curve to the left? Okay, remember what I said to you? It must be a factor that causes CIGX minus M to change, independent of the variable on the y-axis. Okay, so it should be pretty clear, right? Only number D, a fall in general price level will not cause the AD to shift to the left. It will cause a movement along the aggregate demand. When there's a loss in consumer confidence, your C will fall, independent of income or GPL. That's why your AD shifts to the left. If there's a fall in government spending, okay, G, okay, AD curve will shift to the left. If there's a rise in interest rate, the cost of borrowing goes up. Households will borrow less to buy big ticket items, so C will fall. Firms will invest less because there are less investment projects that are profitable. That's why I will fall. Okay, we can rattle off this very fast because for most of us, it's muscle memory. You have to learn this. You have to keep writing this out many, many times to be clear. Okay, so let's go through this. Okay, story so far. We have understood factors that shift the AD curve. I'll give you a break after this. If you increase the AD, right, from figure 1, national income will increase. And you may wonder, right, if I change my aggregate demand by 1 million, how much will your national income change by? So a simple overview of the multiplier before I give you a break. Okay, suppose I increase G by 1 million. Does national income increase by the same amount? Okay, it turns out that it will actually lead to a more than proportionate increase. So if I increase G by 1 million, right, national income usually increase by more than 1 million. Okay, so this is the multiplier concept, which as I've stated, will be covered after the promos. And this is the basic principle. Okay, so I'll give you a short break now. Once you are back, we will come back to factors that shift SRAS and factors that shift LIAS. Thank you. Okay, come back in 15 minutes time. Oh, 15 minutes. Okay, so come back in five minutes time. Okay, sorry, I heard wrongly. We have only 15 minutes left for the lesson, so do come back in 5 minutes time. Right. Okay. I'm glad you all like that song that I played for you to test. Okay, that song is from the drama Tian Long Ba Bu. Okay, they are showing a new one now, but I prefer the old one. Okay, so as you are streaming back, right? Let me show you how you can fill in the first column. If you recall, right? I made you draw a foolscap. I made you use a foolscap paper to draw 3 columns, right? So what you can do is this. Okay, so let's say this is the 3 columns. Okay, you have your AD here, right? So you should have C here. Let's say for C, right, you can say disposable income. You can put wealth. Okay, economic outlook. Okay, all these things. Then your I, there's the rate of interest, business expectations, cost of capital goods. Okay, so as you are drawing this, right, when you go home, and can I encourage all of you when you all go home, right, make sure you all rewrite this into a neat outcome. Then you can either expand this one flow. This is a stock versus flow, all these things. So you need to make this a few times and make sure that all these factors are in your head. Okay, you will find that in your second year, right, these are actually very important. Okay, important. So we are going to talk about SRAS and LRAS. Okay, so I hope all of us are already back. So you can practice. Those of you who are already back, you all can practice filling the first column now. Okay, so let us continue. So we probably won't be able to finish until LRAS, until the macroeconomic equilibrium, but it's fine. Okay, it's fine because your tutors will be going through with you all these things even after your promos exam. Okay, shall we all turn to page? Yeah. Okay, so we are done with aggregate demand. So let's go to aggregate supply now. Okay, so it's basically, you should basically turn to page 5.2.15 now. Can all of you turn to that page now? So what is aggregate supply? Aggregate supply shows the total output of goods and services that domestic firms would like to produce and sell at each general price level for a given period of time. Okay, here's something interesting about the AS curve. The main reason why the AS curve is not the simple upward sloping supply curve that you draw for your microecons is that economists don't really agree on how it looks like. To talk about the AS curve, you need to understand 2 schools of thought. Keynesian economics. So this is what I call the economics that's taught by John Maynard Keynes. Okay, John Maynard Keynes, the one that's responsible for most of the microecons that you are learning now. Okay, let me see. For John Maynard Keynes, right, they believe that the rise in aggregate demand will only lead to a rise in output, but will not lead to an increase in the general price level. They believe that prices are sticky. Now, you can imagine the Great Depression in 1929. I don't know whether you were aware that during 1929, 30, 31, the whole world, right, went through this episode called the Great Depression, where there was huge excess capacity. Many workers were out of job. Many machines were not used. Okay, so this is where anyone who work, even if you pay them very little, they are all desperate for work. So this was a time where John Maynard Keynes rose into fame. So they believe that if the government were to increase G, for example, that shift the AD to the right, he believes that there will be a big rise in the national output, national income, but very little rise in the general price level. Basically, there'll be no inflation when the government increase the aggregate demand. Okay, there are too much unemployed factors of production. However, those who are against John Maynard Keynes, we call them the classical economists, they believe that there's no room for government intervention because they believe that any attempt for the government to increase the aggregate demand through policies will only lead to an increase in general price level, but will never lead to an increase in the real national income. They basically feel that output is not determined by the aggregate demand, but rather the productive capacity of the economy. So they believe that the AS curve is perfectly vertical. Okay, that's how they draw it. They draw it. What about us? Now, in order to have a intermediate, try to reconcile both views, right? We are going to combine these two together to tell you how the AS curve usually is like, okay, which is the upward sloping part. So basically, when you want to draw the AS curve, right, the complete AS curve should have three distinct segments. You should have the horizontal part, the diagonal part, as well as the vertical part. So the horizontal part represents the Keynesian range, the diagonal part represents the intermediate range, the vertical part represents the classical range. How do you draw it? Okay, draw a horizontal part. This is basically the Keynesian range, which is excess capacity during a recession. Draw a diagonal part. Okay, this represents the intermediate range. And finally, draw the vertical part, which is the classical part. So as I've said, right, you can imagine the horizontal part as a part where there's huge excess capacity. The economy has many unemployed labor, unemployed capital. So that's why you have a long horizontal part. So any increase in aggregate demand will not increase the general price level. There's an intermediate part, okay, which is the part that most economies are in now, as well as the vertical part where you have basically reached a full employment level of national income. So when we talk about SRAS, right, we are basically talking about the diagonal part. Now, the horizontal part, right, is rarely the state of the economy. That happens during extreme times like the Great Depression, where there's huge unemployment, massive unemployment. Now, if the pandemic gets worse, right, it might be possible for us to end up being in the horizontal part. But most of us, right, are at the diagonal part, okay, the intermediate part of the AS curve. Then once we reach full employment, we will be at the vertical part, which is the long run aggregate supply. So this is effectively the intermediate part of the neo-Keynesian AS curve. So okay, you may want to take note of this. In HCI, right, in Hwa Chong, we don't want students to shift the horizontal part of the AS curve whenever you shift the SRAS. If I can point to you figure 4 at 5.2.17, can you take a quick look? Can you see that when we shift the AS curve, we never shift the horizontal part. Okay, so other schools, they do allow students to shift the horizontal part up or down, but in HCI, we strongly discourage students from doing that. So from now on, please don't shift the horizontal part. So my advice is this: if to avoid temptation to shift the horizontal part, which might make your tutors unhappy, anytime you want to shift the SRAS, right, can I encourage you, just draw the diagonal part without drawing the horizontal part. So you can draw it like figure 3 in 5.2.16. Do you notice figure 3 in 5.2.16, right? We don't draw the horizontal part. That's because the horizontal part, let me stress again, is rarely the state of the economy. It happens when there's massive unemployment. So that's usually not the case for real world economies now. Okay, so what are factors that shift the SRAS to the left? So you can start filling the second column in your landscape page now. You'll be happy to note that just like one of the factors we often teach you why the supply curve in the demand and supply shift, why the supply curve shift is often the change in the cost of production. Now, you'll be happy to know that in macroecons, right, changes in cost of production will also shift the SRAS. But the key is this: it must be the change in the cost of production for every industry in the country. So it's not just affecting one industry, not just affecting one market, but every industry. So there are some ways in which this can happen. The chief way is a change in energy costs. Okay, one of the frequent topics in case study in the past, right, is when the crude oil price change. So when the crude oil price change, basically you can think of it this way: every industry in the country, right, if you are producing anything, you use power, you use electricity. So anytime the crude oil price would go up, that means the electricity cost will go up, and hence it will raise the cost of production for every industry in the country. So this means you can shift the SRAS to the left. Okay, SRAS to the left. Of course, if there's a fall in the price of crude oil, if there's a fall in electricity cost, it will shift the SRAS to the right. Okay, so one of the key points that frequently appear in your case study is the change in energy prices. So you can write in your second column. Of course, the other thing is supply shock. Okay, anything that, let's say, bad weather that destroy large crops in the world, then this will also shift the SRAS to the left. What we will teach you in next year is that if the workers ask for higher wages that is over and above their productivity growth, this can also lead to the cost of production to rise for every firm in the country that uses workers. Okay, so it's called wage push. So take note, when you shift the SRAS curve, right, it doesn't shift the LRAS curve. Okay, so we will teach you why the LRAS curve shift, but shift in the SRAS curve is change in the aggregate cost of production for every industry in the country, in the economy. Supply shock, as I've said. What about LRAS? Okay, so in a sense, our main work is done when we shift the aggregate demand, right? SRAS, you want to fill in your second column, right? There are two main points. By far, the more popular point is the change in the aggregate cost of production. Not just cost of production, but the aggregate. And of course, supply shock, which is not so as often stated. But what are factors that shift the LRAS curve? Okay, these are the same factors, right, that will shift the boundary of your PPC outwards, which if you recall in the past, anything that changes either the quantity or the quality of the factors of production. If you recall, there are four factors of production, right? Labor, capital, land, entrepreneurship. So any change in any of these quantity or quality will shift the boundary of the PPC outwards. Likewise, it will shift the vertical part of the AS curve to the right. So take note, we will shift the vertical AS curve to the right. It turns out that the SRAS, the diagonal part, will also shift to the right. But as I said, in HCI, do not shift the horizontal part of the AS curve. Okay, your tutors will probably remind you more and more during your tutorial class. Okay, so basically I have about two minutes left, so you can read through the page in 5.2.118. Okay, there are many ways in which the quantity and the quality of the FOP will change. So as you read on, right, take note that what the government can do is that they can either adjust the quality or quantity. All these will cause the long run aggregate supply shift to the right. Okay, so you can also fill in the third column. So let's end off with just giving you some time to fill the third column. So you will say things like, okay, increase in the quantity of L, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, land, increase in the quality. Okay, so thanks for paying attention for this lesson. I hope you have learned a lot on what causes the aggregate demand to shift, and you have been exposed to what causes the SRAS as well as the LRAS to shift. We will be posting to you what will be covered in the promos exam after this lecture. So do take note of the announcement in the Google Classroom. So I'll end this lecture here. Thank you so much. This is Mr. Tan signing off. Bye-bye. Okay, you can log off now.
Bye, Mr. Tan. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
I had an inspiring lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You're so sweet. Okay, I can just end for all.